In Canadian sport, we've had a lot of where were you moments. Where were you in 72? Where were you when Tony Gabriel got the touchdown pass from Tom Clements in the 76 Super Bowl? Where were you where the Blue Jays had their first game in the snow in 77? Where were you when Montreal lost the game by Rick Mundy's home run in the NLCS in 81? And of course, Joe Carter in 93. But the greatest where were you moment, besides a few days before Montreal Canadiens versus Red Army, where the Canadiens dominated pretty well the World Championship team or players, was this contest. For Americans, it means something different, but for us in Canada, it put Bob Cole on the announcing map. Although he had been a key announcer for years, at this point he was pretty well the groomed successor to Danny Gallivan and René Cavalier. When you say to a Canadian, they're going home, everybody knows what we're talking about. It's a team who basically, a bunch of Karens in the 70s, the Russians, whiners and complainers, even though we're buying them blue jeans and all kind of cokes and different things to make them play with us, they were complaining because the Philadelphia Flyers, the Broad Street Bullies, were playing their game and were dominated the game, and basically they quit. Now, the Flyers Red Army game was a famous international ice hockey contest played on January 11, 76 between the Philadelphia Flyers, the two-time defending NHL champions, and HC Siska Moscow, the Central Sports Club of the Army Moscow, Russia. Also known as the Red Army team, as all players were superficially members of the Soviet Union's World Championship and Olympic winning squad. Now, the game was notable for an incident where, after a body check delivered by the Flyers' Ed Van Imp, a very clean check, by the way, Siska's top player, Valery Harmelov, was prone on the ice for a minute, took a dive. When the officials did not call a penalty, the Red Army coach, Konstantin Loknev, pulled his team off the ice in protest, saying later on, "We weren't coming here for a boxing match." Flyer chairman Ed Snyder told Siska to return to the ice and finish the game, which was being broadcast to an international audience on CBC and various myriad networks, or the Soviet Hockey Federation would not get paid the fee to which they were entitled. However, according to NHL President Clarence Campbell, he denied he ever told Koltsakov or Lokhtov about the money. Campbell said somebody on the periphery mentioned it, that's all. They eventually compiled and lost 4-1. The Flyers were the only NHL team that managed to defeat the Red Army that year, despite Montreal outplaying them in the famous New Year's Eve game where they tied Siska 3-3. Now, HC Siska Moscow was considered one of the most dominant club sports teams in history, winning the Soviet Championship for hockey's 13 consecutive years between 77 and 89. Siska played many games against NHL clubs, including a North American tour in 75 and 76. In total, the Red Army played 36 games against NHL teams from 75 to 91 and finished with a combined record of 26-8-2. Now, in the 75-76 series between various NHL teams and the two touring Soviet teams, where the powerhouse Red Army squad and the somewhat lesser Soviet wing squad was another pivotal moment in the tenuous relations between the NHL and the Soviet hockey program. The games, like the subsequent Canada Cup tournaments, which also began later that year, summer of 76, were not treated like exhibitions. Coming into the final match of NHL series, the Red Army was still undefeated, having tied the Montreal Canadiens and beaten the other NHL teams they face. Their final game was played at the famous Philadelphia Spectrum in Philadelphia against the two-time defending Stanley Cup champion Flyers, who had a myriad of tough and solid players on the team. Both Soviet teams were supplemented by other all-stars from their league. Now, before Siska had arrived in Philadelphia, the Soviet players and hockey leaders were aware of the rough reputation, again, of the BSB squad. Pravda cartoon that portrayed the Flyers as Neanderthal thugs wielding clubs instead of sticks. Well, Bobby Clarke did lay that slash in game 6 in the 72 series in Russia, so they knew what they were getting. Flyers captain Bobby Clarke, reputation again, when he slashed Harlamov, which put him out pretty well for the rest of the series in game 6, mostly due to prodding by former Montreal Canadian enforcer John Ferguson Sr. Now, Flyers owner Ed Snyder had several reasons to dislike the Soviets, in addition to Soviet-Western political tensions. Tough, often contentious negotiations took place with Soviet officials before the series became a reality, in which Snyder was actively involved. Now, get this. The Flyers owner found his patience tried by a difficult negotiating process with the Soviet officials. Snyder was criticized by some as being hypocritical for allowing his hockey team to participate in a series that would pump money into Soviet coffers. Pay for play, as we say. Finally, there were strictly hockey-related reasons for Snyder to dislike the Soviets so strongly. The diametrically opposed styles of hockey practiced by the Flyers and the Red Army team created an instant source of conflict. Although the Flyers in the mid-70s were actually a very skilled team, with the likes of future Hall of Famers Bobby Clarke, Bill Barber, and Bertie Bra, plus all-star caliber talents such as Reggie Leach, Rick McClish, and defenseman Jimmy Watson, they were best known for their aggressive brand of physical play, including Dave Schultz, Michael Hargy, Kendra Chuck, Young Goodenough, a rough squad. Snyder's competitive Flyers were stoked by the realization that the chance to play the Soviets represented a chance to prove that his club was the best team in the world and much more than the Goon squad. Now, a goodwill get-together before the game was fraught with tension. Flyers announcer Gene Hart, who spoke Russian, taught Flyers overhead Snyder to say a phrase in Russian, wishing the best for both teams in the upcoming game. When the time came, there was no mingling whatsoever between the Soviet contingent and Flyers staff and players. When Snyder took to the podium, he spoke tersely and omitted the phrase Hart had taught him. Snyder later said, "When I looked at those cold faces, I just couldn't do it." Clark later said that he really hated those bastards on the Soviet side and could not wait to take the ice against them once again. So, see, you got to understand, ladies and gentlemen, the 4 games in Canada had American referees, but as soon as we got to Russia after the debacle in Sweden, they put a bunch of referees that the Soviets had in their pockets. We were getting penalty after penalty after penalty after penalty. It was war, say like Phil Esposito. That's why you got a penalty, I think, for the second time for no reason in 2 games. He did the across the neck thing, which me in Canada, I'm going to fucking get you. Now, the Flyers had dictated the game's tempo from the start and were able to take the body on the Soviet players and avoid getting caught in a Soviet up-tempo transition game. In the first, with the game still scoreless, Flyers defenseman Ed Van Impe, who had just finished serving a penalty for hooking, left the box and immediately placed a hard hit that knocked out Harlamov. Harlamov lay prone on the ice for a minute when Lloyd Gilmore, the referee, refused to call a penalty, maintaining that Van Impe's check was clean. Red Army coach Loktev protested by pulling the team from the ice. This memorably led to Canadian CBC commentator Bob Cole, who announced the Summit Series for CBC Radio in 72, saying they're going home. And he added this, in 72 we took it. He said in 74 we took it because we were fucked over in 74 as well. And they're going home. And it wasn't objectivity there. Everybody was thinking what he was saying. Snyder eventually got in a shouting match with the president of the Soviet Hockey Federation, threatening to not pay for the series if he did not return to the ice. The Soviets prolonged the game stoppage by arguing to make the return to the ice conditional on the referee canceling their impending delay of game bench penalty. Eventually, they accepted the penalty and came back to the ice. The game delay tactic backfired on them as they returned to find the Flyers even more resolute than before. The Flyers scored quickly after play resumed and never looked back. One key contribution to the Flyers' win was a technical decision made by Flyer head coach Fred Shero to stand up the Red Army attack at the Flyers' defensive blue line rather than just back off the line, which caught the Red Army off guard since no other NHL team had tried this tactic. The Flyers ended up outshooting the Red Army squad 49-13 en route to the well-deserved 4-1 victory. Soviet referee Yuri Karandin officiated the game as a linesman. Now, after the contest, Flyers head coach Fred Shero jokingly told low-scoring defenseman Joe Watson they had set the Soviet hockey program back 25 years by scoring a shorthanded goal on the great Vladislav Tretiak. Amidst the Flyers' pride in their convincing victory against an outstanding team, the seeds of contentiousness had grown even further. To this day, Tretiak, who views the tie game into form at the high point of the series, says that the Flyers won by playing, get this, rude hockey. Coach Loktev called the Flyers a bunch of animals. The Flyers, meanwhile, left with the belief that the Soviet team had confirmed their feelings that Russian players were skilled but soft. Bill Donnell, the Toronto Star, had written this comment after close of the series. The Moscow Musketeers had to put a big fat 0 on their aptitude test by pulling one of the dumbest tricks in sports. They hauled their team off the ice. Loktev knew the conditions before he came. This was before Tikhonov came in, by the way. Nobody loves playing in Philadelphia. Once he accepted the game with the Flyers on NHL rules with an NHL referee, he was the same boat as the Maple Leafs or Canucks when they come to town. Locktoff wanted his team to know what it's like to play the Flyers in Philly under NHL conditions, and he found out, well, that's what it's like. Now, a little more than a decade after Showdown at Spectrum, the Soviet Union was crumbling politically. Now, in order to raise funds, the Soviet hockey program started to negotiate or sell or auction off selected prominent national team members to be dispersed to NHL squads. The Snyders refused to get the Flyers involved in seeking to acquire any Soviet players, citing the fact that the Soviet officials were demanding a large portion of the players' NHL salaries be diverted in their hands rather than given to the players. At one point, I think with the Calgary and the Devils players, upwards of 30 to 40%, allegedly. Eventually, the Flyers would scout and draw players from the Soviet Union and its successor states on the same basis as they did players from any hockey country. Now, video of the game, you got to watch the CBC English Bob Cole announcing the game, because the Spectrum was also poorly lit. And it's kind of weird. It's almost like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, the third Mad Max movie. 2 went in there, 1 man leave. But the Russians were scared of the Flyers. They weren't scared of the Montreal Canadiens on New Year's Eve 75. And ironically, little tidbit about that, my dear departed mother whined all day that she wanted to go have my father accompanying her to the Legion New Year's Eve dance that night instead of going with her friends, even though my father wanted to watch the game. It was epic, and it kind of ruined the relationship from now on. Eventually led to a divorce. This is a true story. Peter Mahovlich apologized for not beating the Russians on New Year's Eve. Allegedly, 2 Montreal Canadiens were interviewed for Francophone press in Quebec, asking about the Flyers, pushing them around. He said, we put up with that shit in 72. This was our game at home. And like in 72, they stole the steaks, they sold the cokes, they made the wives, they weren't going to allow the NHL player wives to come over. They were causing all kind of stir. This was building up from 72 and 74 as well. 74 was a shit show as well, because the WHA players were not allowed in 72, were angry in 74. Then when they were finally allowed in, Cheevers and Bobby Hull and everybody else, the J.C. Tremblay. But ladies and gentlemen, if you like the Philadelphia Flyers, you hate the Russians. It's 47 years ago, but that will draw so much interest. You take the NFC East rivalry is big between the Eagles and Dallas or San Francisco against some of the key teams in that division. This is nothing. If you're an American who doesn't ever watch hockey, should watch this. And I've traveled in the States when Americans called Canadian communists. Well, go fuck yourself. There's no communists in Canada because we hate the Russians of that era, and they're all a bunch of freaking communists, automatons. Not like Valerie Bury, whatchamacallum's wife there, the lady from Full House there, her husband. Yeah, named married a Christian who marries a Russian called Valerie Bury. That's a different ballgame altogether. But at fucking 68, the Czechoslovakian rise, the Stashneys and everybody else, to pass the Canada Cup when he started to fade. Boys, oh boys, ladies and gentlemen, there was not one communist in Canada. Communist Party couldn't even get votes. We got 3 communist parties in Canada, by the way, federally, and you still can't get votes because of what happened in 72. See, it all runs together. 72, 74, 76. And in 77, Worlds. Don't even talk about that. In 78 with Paymont and Ellis coming back. It's like a soap opera. Hockey is life in Canada. It's also a crackpot soap opera. So if you like what we're doing here, we're a historical podcast on world hockey history. Let us know with a like, comment, subscribe, or share. By the way, do not watch all 8 games of Canada or Russia back to back with someone in your family that's Canadian over the age of 75. It could cause a heart attack, a stroke, because just like Son of a Critch, the Malcolm McDowell character, the grandfather, that's the ideal people. The people that were 10 years old in 1972 are 61 now, and it's like war. That's we have World War One, World War Two, Korea, and Summit Series 72 and 74 and Super Series 76. It all runs together. And if you're an American, you don't even know what I'm talking about, well, that's why you're American. Canadians, we don't give a fuck about politics. We give a shit about hockey. That's the way we are. Hockey's our game. You can make fun of us for anything or accent or whatever, but you say Connor McDavid is not a very good player. You don't hear a Canadian bragging up Alexander Ovechkin, do you? That's all the U.S. press and Mike Milbury, don't you know? Have a good one. Bye.